Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. It's a real honor to be part of this webinar series and sharing my work on uncontrollable pain with you and the role that the reward system may play when dealing with uncontrollable pain. There we go. I don't have any conflict of interests, and I'm probably not telling you any news when I say that there is a huge comorbidity rate between chronic pain and depression. According to latest reports, it is said that about 40% of all chronic pain patients actually also have signs of clinical depression. And a couple of years back, we postulated a model that suggested that alterations of the reward system might be a potential diathesis, so a common factor leading to both the development of depression as well as chronic pain. And in my work, I'm really interested in reward mechanisms and their interaction with the ability to cope with uncontrollable pain and how that might be related to the development of the comorbidity between pain and depression. But let's step a little bit back. Why would we even look at pain and reward, given that the two concepts are quite opposing? But I guess we can all think of some situations where we have been in a lot of pain and situations that were uncomfortable. However, knowing that there is a reward waiting for us, some sort of light at the end of the tunnel, made this pain just a little bit more endurable. And that's really how we study reward in my lab, where we see reward as an opportunity, something that helps us to potentially deal with pain and cope with it better. And this idea is based on some old work of mine still coming from my PhD, where we showed that pain can compensate for the negative mood that pain puts us in, and it can then directly reduce the severity of the pain as well. I'll walk you quickly through the experiments that led us to this or to these conclusions. The first one was a behavioral study in healthy individuals, and we invited in total 35 people to come to the lab twice for 2 sessions. In each of these sessions, people were engaged in an incentive delay task, and I explain it here in a bit more detail because we reuse this task or similar tasks throughout the studies that I will still present. So in this incentive delay task, people would always see a certain amount of money being displayed first at the beginning of each trial, and this incentive could be low, so a couple of cents really, $1 or $4, and that's the amount of money that people then played for in this specific trial. Shortly after, people saw a target cue on the screen, and they were instructed to press a button as quickly as they could. If they pressed the button quickly enough, they would win the amount of money that was displayed at the beginning of the trial. However, if they pressed too early, too late, or not at all, they would get 0 for this round, for this trial, and then the next trial would start. Now, I said that people came in for 2 sessions. In one of the 2 sessions, we treated the lower leg of the participants with capsaicin cream, so sensitized the leg to heat stimuli and then applied a relatively large heating pad to their lower leg, applying an intensity that people perceived as moderately painful, so pain rating of 5 to 7 out of 10. And we left this painful stimulus on for the entire time of the session, so for approximately 1 hour. So they played the incentive delay task while in pain. In the second session, we gave them the same heating pad, but this time we didn't sensitize the skin to heat. We used a normal moisturizer, and as a result, participants then perceived the warmth or the thermal stimulus as pleasantly warm and non-painful. And we were obviously interested to see what influence having pain has on engaging in reward. And what we found was the following: people were generally very motivated to obtain the rewards. We see on the y-axis here the reaction times. You see they're really, really fast, roughly between 210 and 230 milliseconds. And starting with the control condition first here, we see that people reacted relatively fast to the small incentive, and significantly faster for $1, and then kept this this motivation up for the high reward of $4. Now, when people were in pain, they managed to increase their response speed even further and reacted significantly faster in response to the target button when the incentive was high. And this increase in motivation when people were in pain was correlated to how much pain people perceived. So the more unpleasant people found the pain, the higher the motivation to get the high incentive. So the way we interpreted that was like, you give me a lot of pain here, this sucks, at least I want to get a lot of money out of the situation. Hence the statement that reward may help to compensate for the bad mood that pain puts us in. We then did a series of studies that was in collaboration with Susanne Becker, showing that obtaining reward has a direct analgesic effect. So if we give people a painful stimulus and some sort of reward at the same time, typically monetary rewards, people perceive the stimulus as less painful compared to a situation where we give them the same stimulus and a neutral or a losing outcome at the same time. So we thought this is brilliant. We should use these mechanisms and use them clinically, and we discussed that in this review article here. However, the reality looks a little more complex. What we know from chronic pain patients is that they seem to have a blunted reward system. So their responses, brain responses to reward seem reduced. And I am, just to illustrate that, I am showing one study here. There's at least 5 out there, all showing very similar things. This study by Volteros, who invited chronic pain patients, in this case fibromyalgia patients and healthy controls, and engaged them in the Iowa gambling task. The aim of this task is to maximize winnings, and they get winnings by drawing cards from 4 different decks of cards. And 2 of the 4 decks are advantageous, meaning that in the long run, you'll have more gains than losses. The immediate reward may not be as high, but overall you have more gains and losses. And then the remaining 2 decks are considered the disadvantageous decks. Although immediate rewards may be higher, in the long run you lose more than you win. So it's smarter not to take from these 2 decks. And obviously initially nobody knows which of the 2 decks are the 2 advantageous, or they don't know that there are advantageous and disadvantageous decks. They have to figure that out by trying to draw cards from the different decks and then improve their behavior based on the reward feedback that they have received. And so at the beginning, basically, everybody would draw cards from all 4 decks similarly often, and that is indicated here on the y-axis by 0, meaning, people just randomly take cards from each of the decks, and you see then sort of positive numbers on the y-axis here indicate that people take more cards from the advantageous decks, and negative numbers would indicate people taking more cards from the disadvantageous decks. And you see for the healthy controls here that while initially taking cards from all 4 decks, over time they get better and better. So based on their reward feedback, they can then adjust their behavior and improve on the task. And we see that this learning based on reward is not happening in chronic pain patients at all over time. Now, this can be driven by various things. You could imagine that maybe chronic pain patients are just not as happy when being rewarded, or indeed they can't learn from their reward feedback. So maybe they can't take the information on board and then translate that into better behavioral choices. Another option might be, or an explanation might be, that chronic pain patients just don't care so much for a little bit of monetary reward that they can earn in an experimental study. So we thought it's important to understand reward processing or reward motivation in patients better, and did a next study where instead of using monetary rewards, we used pain avoidance as an incentive, thinking that pain avoidance is something that would be equally attractive to people with pain and as well as healthy controls. So what we did in the study is we invited people with migraines, migraineurs, and healthy controls to come to the lab, and we put them in the scanner. Our migraine patients were all episodic migraineurs with 1 to 14 migraine days per month. So I had migraines relatively frequently. We put everybody in the scanner, and while they were in the scanner, they were engaged in the following task. Just want to say, in the interest of time, I'm focusing on the behavioral results of this study only. So once in the scanner, we engaged our participants again in an incentive delay task, but this time, instead of trying to get a lot of money out of it, people tried to avoid painful shocks. We used electric shocks in this experiment and get a non-painful one instead. In order to avoid the painful shock, people had to press a button very fast whenever they saw, or as soon as they saw a target cue on the screen. And how difficult it was to avoid the painful stimulus was always indicated to people at the beginning of the trial. So in the easy condition, people had to react really, really fast when the target cue came up. In the difficult condition, even faster. And then we had a safe condition. In a safe condition, people would always get the non-painful shock as long as they pressed the button eventually, which they always did. And obviously what we're interested in on a behavior level, again, is the reaction time task as an indicator for like how motivated are people to avoid the upcoming painful stimulus. Now, what we wanted to see is, in addition to the group difference, is also whether people would change in their motivation depending on what happened on the previous trial. So we compared trials that followed successful pain avoidance on the previous trial. So people tried hard previously and were rewarded for their efforts, like avoided the painful shock, and compared that to trials where people were previously unsuccessful. So if I tried really hard on the previous trial, however, I wasn't successful, I received the painful stimulus, does that have an influence on my motivation in the next trial? And what we found was, first looking at the migraine-free participants or healthy controls, we see that with increasing task difficulty, people manage to increase in the response speed. So this time on the y-axis, we have response speed, that's 1 over reaction time, with higher numbers indicating higher motivation. And so in addition to this increase in response speed with task difficulty, we also saw that after unsuccessful pain avoidance on the previous trial, the motivation to avoid the next upcoming painful stimulus is somewhat reduced, specifically for the difficult conditions. So if I wasn't successful in my previous trial and I now see that the upcoming trial is difficult, people didn't manage to show quite the same response speed as in the other condition when it followed successful pain avoidance. And this reduction, or this effect here, is even more extreme in our migraine patients. So we see a strong reduction in motivation following unsuccessful pain avoidance in our migraine patients. Now, this reduction in motivation following unsuccessful pain avoidance in migraine patients was correlated to helplessness scores, meaning that patients who feel particularly helpless about their clinical pain also showed a much stronger reduction in the motivation to avoid painful stimuli after an unsuccessful trial in our task. Vice versa, people or patients who don't feel helpless about their migraines at all, feel quite in control, showed the opposite effect. Some of them got even better and were more motivated in a trial that followed an unsuccessful pain avoidance attempt previously. And we don't see this correlation for our healthy controls. Now, just to summarize that, what this study showed us is that helplessness in migraineurs is related to a greater reduction in motivation to avoid pain following a previously unsuccessful pain avoidance attempt. And this implies that it's really not just the mere experience of clinical pain that compromises our motivation, but rather an interaction of this experience with the individual's perception of how much or how little control they have over it. And that got me really quite interested in this perception of having control over pain, or rather the lack of control over pain. And the more I speak to chronic pain patients, the more I hear that this is really the part that bothers many patients the most. They've tried so many different things and nothing really works for them. They feel they're completely out of control. When we look into clinical studies, we know that this feeling of not having control over pain is typically associated with poor treatment outcomes. It's associated with higher pain reports and ultimately the development of depression. So I started to work with Tim Solomons, and we both agreed that this clinical phenomenon is important enough to sort of study it further, and we wanted to back translate it to the lab to really understand the psychological and neural consequences of sort of losing control over pain better. But how do we model not having control over pain? Well, we're using a paradigm that uses scenes from the Where's Wally cartoons. Why people see these scenes, we give them electric shocks at the same time. And the electric shocks are typically, they're targeted to induce a moderate pain sensation. So we say, don't worry about the pain too much, because as soon as you find Wally in the scene, Wally is the character here shown on the upper left part of the slide. If you see Wally in the scenes, you click on Wally and the pain will stop immediately. Now people have up to 3 attempts to find Wally. What we don't tell them is that we actually take Wally out of the scenes. So Wally is in none of the scenes, which means that trial after trial after trial, participants attempt to control their pain and learn that no matter what they do, there is no way for them to have an influence on how much pain they were exposed to. We also have a control group. In the control group, we leave Wally in the scenes, and the task works exactly the way we instruct people. And so the controllable group they are able to find Wally in the scenes, and when they click on Wally, the pain will stop immediately. They get positive feedback and then rate their pain. Now, the important thing is that both groups are matched for physical input, meaning that both groups received exactly the same number of electric stimuli across the different trials, as indicated here by the group differences in this graph. So the way we did this is we always started with a control person or controllable person, and they played the task and received the number of stimuli per trial, sort of dependent on their performance. We then recorded their stimulation time course and played that back to the next participant, who was then in the uncontrollable condition, meaning that these two participants would receive exactly the same number of stimuli per trial. The only difference between the two groups is that the controllable group knew that the number of trials they received was directly dependent on their performance, whereas for the uncontrollable group, it all was random. It had nothing to do with their performance. They had no control. At the end of each scene, people would receive feedback. So the uncontrollable group would always get negative feedback, too slow, frowning face, and then we're asked for a pain rating. After every 5th trial, we asked people to also rate how much effort they'd put into finding Wally, to just sort of track motivation across the 50 trials that we had. And we tested 38 people here in total, 42 in the uncontrollable group and 41 in the controllable. 41 in the controllable one, 42 in the uncontrollable one. But does that really change psychological state? So all we do is we expose people to uncontrollable pain for all of 18 to 20 minutes. Does that really change anything? And the short answer is yes, it really does. We've now used the paradigm repeatedly, and we can see that the uncontrollable group increases significantly in their anxiety ratings. due to the exposure to uncontrollable pain. So the two groups did not differ at baseline before the task in their anxiety ratings. However, they differ significantly after the exposure to Whereas Wally, and only the uncontrollable group increases in anxiety significantly. We further see that the exposure to uncontrollable pain decreases people's positive moods. At the same time, it increases negative mood, and the exposure to uncontrollable pain decreases the motivation. So you see that by only exposing people to uncontrollable pain for all of 20 minutes, we elicit sort of the core symptoms of any affective psychopathology: changes in arousal and anxiety, changes in affect, and changes in motivation. And when you think about that, you can only imagine what this feeling of not having control over pain does to people who experience it on a daily basis. So not having control over pain elicits signs of learned helplessness, sort of like grouping these symptoms as learned helplessness, typically referring to this increased arousal, increased anxiety, lower mood, and motivation, lower motivation. But is that specific to pain, though? Well, we repeated the same experiment in an online study where instead of using painful stimuli, we used aversive sounds. We used 3 different aversive sounds just to make sure people wouldn't get used to the sounds too much, wouldn't adapt too much. So we used a woman scream. We had the sounds of cats fighting and the sounds of nails scratching on a blackboard, all relatively aversive. And other than that, the setup was exactly the same. Instead of, and that's an important difference, instead of an active control group here, so people who could control the outcome, we had a passive control group. The passive control group was just asked to passively sit there and experience the sounds and look at the scenes. And here we could then see if we see any changes in psychological states just due to the mere exposure to uncontrollable aversive sounds. So, or in other words, in order to see these changes in psychological states, do we need to have this perception of I should be able to control the situation, but I can't, or is it sufficient to just be exposed to these stimuli? And what we see is very much in line with what I showed you for the pain experiment. We see that the uncontrollable group increases significantly in anxiety, and that more so than the passive control group. And we didn't test for affective state in this experiment, but we also checked for effort ratings, so motivational ratings, and we see that the motivation decreased in the uncontrollable group significantly over time as well, whereas in the control group it stayed approximately the same. Yeah, so that means that not having control over pain reliably elicits signs of learned helplessness, but this is not specific to pain at all. It applies pretty much equally to other uncontrollable aversive situations. Good. So we know what it does to, or what uncontrollable pain does to psychological states, but what about pain sensitivity? And here I want to give you a bit more of a background. One of the central studies to look into pain sensitivity dependent on how much control we have over the pain stimulus comes from Anne Brescia when Anne came to Montreal to do parts of her PhD there with Susanne and Petra Schweinhardt. And what she did in her study is she gave people a thermal stimulus to their arm, and the initial temperature was adjusted to a moderately painful stimulus. So again, something between 5 and 7. And she asked people in this first condition, and the first condition was always the controllable condition. She asked people to keep this initial temperature constant over a time course of 20 seconds. So whenever people felt the temperature was going down, they could press an up button to upregulate it again. When they felt the temperature had gone up, they could press a down button to bring it back down. And if they felt there weren't any changes, they could just press the remain button, basically. So let's imagine people did that over the time course of 20 seconds. They would then sort of create a temperature time course similar to this one here. In the next condition, Anna then played this time course back to participants. This time they couldn't change the temperature at all. She just merely asked them to sort of endure the pain and consistently give pain ratings throughout the 20 seconds. And the idea was that if controllability didn't play a role at all, people should receive the stimulus as relatively constant over time, because that's what they'd adjusted within the controllable condition. And what they found is that people did not perceive this temperature time course as consistent over time at all. In fact, they saw a continuous increase in pain sensitivity over time when people weren't in control of the painful stimulus, suggesting that we see pain sensitization in the uncontrollable condition. And that is pretty much in line with earlier studies. I think the earliest studies in this field came from Katja Wiech in Oxford. She exposed people to two conditions. She gave them electric shocks. And in one condition, she said, if it ever gets too much, you can press a button. So you are in control of how much pain stimuli you receive here. In the other conditions, the control was not with the self, but was with an external entity. Either, she said, the experimenter will press the button to stop the pain, or the computer will decide when to stop the pain. And what she saw is that when people felt in control over their pain, they rated the same stimulus as somewhat less intense than in a situation where something or someone else had control over their pain. And I think that really became textbook knowledge. When we're not in control of our pain, we perceive it as more intense than in a situation where we can control it. But is that really always the case? If you look a bit further, there is also studies showing the opposite. This study here by Kim Solomons, that was done approximately 10 years after Katja did her studies. He again compared how pain feels when it can either be controlled or it cannot be controlled. But in his paradigm, the uncontrollable pain wasn't controlled by a computer or by someone else, but at least seemingly the control depended on the individual's capability to perform well on the task. And in both groups, he saw that over the time course of the experiment, pain ratings increased, but he saw that in the controllable group, pain increased more over time than in the uncontrollable group. So that is sort of in contrast to what Katja and Anna showed. And maybe whether uncontrollability is associated with an increase or a relative decrease in pain is maybe context dependent. So maybe it depends on whether I am not able to control the pain, or whether something or someone else is controlling the pain. Well, let's have a look at our own data, again, where people perceived that controllability of the painful stimulus was within their, or was dependent on their own performance. And what we see is very much in line with Tim's study. We see for both groups, the controllable and the uncontrollable pain group, that pain increased over time. In blue, the uncontrollable group, and in orange, brown, the controllable group. And while both groups increased in their pain ratings over time, again, we see that the controllable pain group increased more than the uncontrollable pain group. And the other thing we see is that they have this funny rhythmic pattern in their pain ratings, where every so often they seem to really spike in their pain ratings. So what happened there? My initial hypothesis was that the controllable people maybe reacted more to differences in their feedback. Remember, they got positive and negative feedback depending on their performance. So I thought maybe every time they got negative feedback, they then also rated the pain as higher. That analysis didn't lead to anything. I then thought maybe it depended on the number of stimuli they received, because in some charts they were maybe successful, but because it was a difficult scene. they still had received lots and lots of stimuli. So maybe that then, I mean, that would make sense, right? Would increase the pain ratings, but again, that didn't yield anything. So I then thought it's really so frequent. Let me look into this sort of like pattern a bit further. And what I saw is like it's really after every fifth trial, we see the spike in pain intensity ratings or pain unpleasantness ratings. And I mentioned earlier briefly that after every fifth trial, we asked people to rate how motivated they were to find Wally in the scenes. And so the way it worked, it was always the scene first, then feedback, then pain rating, and then, well, at least in every fifth trial, and then at the end, they would rate how much effort they have shown to find Wally. And it's not in that trial, in this specific trial, that they had a high pain rating, but always in the following one. So it seems like every time people had to rate their effort, in the following trial, they found the pain much more painful. And we see a similar pattern in the uncontrollable group, but a lot less pronounced. I wanted to investigate that a bit further, sort of the relationship between the effort ratings or the motivation ratings and this increase in pain intensity. And we see that, at least in the controllable group, there was a correlation between the two. So those people who described to have put a lot of effort into finding Wally increased more in their pain ratings in the following trial, so the trial following the effort rating. The same correlation, it was not significant for our uncontrollable group, but it goes in the same direction. And when you compare the two correlations, the correlation coefficients directly to each other, there is no significant difference between the two. Yeah. Why would effort ratings possibly influence pain reports? Well, this is just based on further readings that I did. I still have to test that more systematically. Potentially, there were some feelings of unfairness, and we know that negative emotions increase our pain sensitivity. So maybe people thought along the lines like, I tried so hard to escape this pain, and I just indicated how much I tried to escape the pain, and yet this pain keeps coming up. Feels unfair, therefore, they then spike in their pain ratings. Or something like effort justification could play a role here as well. So we attribute more importance to outcomes that are associated with greater efforts. So again, thinking maybe that if I tried so hard to avoid this pain, it must be extremely intense or significant, because why would I try so hard otherwise, right? And therefore sort of increasing in their pain ratings immediately after giving, or in the trial after having given the motivation ratings. Well, how can we summarize the effect of uncontrollability on pain ratings best? Well, pain reports seem to increase when someone or something else is in control of my pain. That's sort of potentially perceived as increased threat. Sort of, if I depend on your goodwill to stop my pain, that is potentially threatening. And therefore I perceive this pain as more intense. Now, in pain reports are or seem to be reduced when people learn that it's due to their own ability that they can't avoid the pain. And this could be either driven by an even greater task engagement. That's what Tim Solomon's proposed in his study. Maybe the uncontrollable group just tries so much harder until the end to figure out how the game really works, and are therefore more distracted from the pain. And that's why the pain ratings don't rise as much as in the controllable group. That is likely in our task because we asked people specifically for the motivation ratings, and we saw that motivation ratings kept lowering consistently over time. So it doesn't seem like our uncontrollable group was more engaged. Alternatively, it might be that in our uncontrollable group, we reach some sort of anhedonic state with sort of flattened emotional responses to pain, where participants no longer react to other psychological states or things that are happening in the context to the same extent as people in the controllable condition. Now, the last thing that was left for us, or what we really wanted to get at with this paradigm, is the who. So who is or who isn't able to cope with uncontrollable pain? And before participants were exposed to uncontrollable pain in our experiment, they had to complete a battery of questionnaires, including depression questionnaires, anhedonia, different coping styles, the individual urge to control the situation, reward sensitivity as part of the BISBAS questionnaire, and pain catastrophizing. And out of all these factors, the only variable that had predictive value was reward sensitivity. And normally we would almost assume that, or typically we would assume, I guess, that people who have a very active reward system are more resilient. But we saw quite the opposite here. We saw that people with a high reward responsivity were the people who struggled the most when they couldn't control their pain. Here indicated is those people high in reward sensitivity, indicating a stronger reduction in positive affect, so had lower mood due to the exposure to uncontrollable pain. This change in mood was then associated with higher anxiety. So it seems that reward responsivity is sort of at the core of the psychological changes that we saw when we exposed people to uncontrollable pain. And just because it's nice to show replication, in our online study using aversive sounds, we saw something very similar. As I said earlier, we didn't assess for changes in mood, but we did test for anxiety level. And again, people who reported to be more reward sensitive were also the people who then increased the most in anxiety following to the exposure to uncontrollable aversive sound. Now, how does that fit in with previous ideas about reward characteristics and the development of chronic pain and or depression? And I said already, sort of, if you wanted to see the textbook knowledge, probably the idea is like a reactive reward system is associated with resilience. But again, that's not always the case. There's a nice study, still relatively recent, by Martin Löffler and colleagues, who have shown that people who have a particularly responsive reward system seem to be more at risk of developing chronic pain. So what they did is they put people with an initial back pain episode in the scanner and let them play a reward task. And the people who had a very strong brain response to reward or to anticipating reward were more likely to receive a chronic pain diagnosis a couple of months later. Furthermore, and that's what I'm indicating or illustrating here on the graph, the stronger this brain response to reward, here indicated on the y-axis, the higher the pain ratings 6 months down the line. So it really had this predictive value. And this is very much in line with our findings that if your reward system is just a little too active, you're setting yourself up for not being able to deal with pain quite so well. And even before these findings of the study by Martin came out, Sakina Rizvi, Tim Selimans, and I postulated published a model that postulated that alterations of the reward system would make people more vulnerable to the development of chronic pain and or depression, depending on the stresses that people are exposed to. Well, the data we had available at that time point all hinted towards a blunted reward system being or making people more vulnerable to develop chronic pain and or depression. And while I think this model is still very much valid, I would now adjust it according to our latest findings, or the latest findings that were published. And instead of sort of assuming this linear relationship between reward sensitivity and the ability to cope with pain, I would rather suggest this curvilinear, this inverted U-shaped relationship between reward sensitivity and the ability to cope with distress. Assuming that now thinking that both extreme ends of reward sensitivity are associated with poorer coping. So if we then adjust our model accordingly, we would think that these people at the extreme ends of reward sensitivity have this diminished ability to cope with aversive events. And if these people are then exposed not to any old pain, but to pain that is perceived specifically as uncontrollable, makes them more vulnerable to develop chronic pain and/or depression. And with that, I would like to thank the people who contributed to the studies and the agent funding or the funding agencies for supporting our research. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.